So nice to see you both. Thank you both so much for joining me on Zoom today. I'm really pleased that we can meet like this, even if we can't meet physically, especially since we last met at the end of Nicola's exhibition at the Side Business School about a year ago. It seems really fitting to be able to meet again like this. And thank you both for joining us today at Zuleika Gallery, and really looking forward to hearing both of you talk about Nicola's work. And Renee, I'll leave it to you now. I know you've got lots of questions to ask Nicola. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Lizzie, for inviting me. It's really exciting to be here, and I'm so impressed by Nicola's work. So yeah, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Why don't we get started? Actually, I guess, given all the events that are going on right now in the US, how do you view this exhibition in the context of what's going on right now?
I'm really sort of reminded of when I spent time on Obama's first election campaign back in 2008. I spent a huge amount of time talking to often quite elderly African-American women. And they told me so many incredible things, but many of them had witnessed Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech themselves. We're now 12 years sort of after 2008, but they were sort of speaking in 50-year time spans. And they kind of foretold where we are now. So right now, I kind of slightly feel like I'm living in those kind of conversations that I had with these incredible women back in 2008. And Obama himself talks, whenever I have seen him, about the kind of a long arc of time. And this work, my work in many ways, is about how long-term hope and change really are. And as human beings, we want our hope and change to be fulfilled very quickly, and we want to see effects quickly, but actually sometimes it can take generations. A lot of the themes that are contained in my work have kind of been brought to the fore. Lots of people looking at my work now perhaps understand it in a way that when I first made it 12 years ago, it wasn't fully understood.
Could you maybe say a bit more about the motivation for having this exhibit now? So you said you're not surprised by the backlash, that there was backlash, but so do you view it as symbolic to have this exhibit now? And
that's a good question. I mean, I made two prints, Unity 1 and Unity 2, kind of, which are a development of my Circle of Hands, which in 7 days series are the kind of day one light, and I've made them kind of with red and blue, thinking about kind of American politics specifically, and thinking about that kind of how as human beings we come together and how we can completely opposing views, and whether we can hold completely opposing views and live alongside each other. Right now, at this point in time in American politics, and with this particular inauguration coming up, it's really kind of, that's a really prescient and pertinent question everybody is thinking about. It's on the news all day, every day, not just in America, but around the world. So it's exhibit right now, because actually that is what is contained in my work in 7 days, even though a lot of it I made back in 2008, 2010, 2012, the questions that are on everybody's mind right now with this particular election, and in particular this inauguration, are sort of contained in my work.
As you know, I'm doing some work on art and gender, and I've been thinking more and more about the role of art as sort of like a catalyst for cultural change.
Yeah.
So I find it fascinating that you've done this work and that you're showing this work at this point in time. So it's not just, interpreting or witnessing, it's also potentially serving as sort of like I said, a catalyst in some sense.
When I was making this work, I spent 3 years in kind of monastic silence. I didn't tell anyone I was making this work. That's how much I didn't want the work to get kind of drawn back into the day and the moment. I want my children and my children's children to look at this work and think about what can we do? How this work can be read on many levels, but on one level it's what does it take to achieve something impossible as human beings? And I had this kind of imagining of my children thinking about the environment and how can we do something that seems completely impossible and against the odds. How can we do it? Actually, this was a story things can be done when people come together. It's not perfect, but they really can be done. and you know, I had imagining about how this work could serve, you know, future generations to think about their own issues that are nothing to do with party politics. So yeah, I mean, I really do see this work as a kind of very quiet in some ways, but absolutely as a sort of ongoing activism. It's, you know.
Well, yeah, I totally agree. I think this is fascinating thing to think about, especially now, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement. There's so many issues around gender equality, and if you think about, you know, what are the best ways to affect change, it seems art would definitely be one of the really important ways to actually try to change culture. So I guess getting to something that really fascinates me, you talk a lot about your children. And so I guess I sort of have two questions in some sense related to this. So first, how do they view it? And second, in some sense, what fascinates me almost more than the art itself, you as going out there and achieving something that probably very few people would have even thought of doing and accomplishing. And so, you know, that in itself is activism and role modeling. And I'm just curious, you know, what do your children think, and how do you think this whole work has affected them?
Yeah, well, this piece, Struggle, I don't know if you can see it there, but that is a part of the series of In 7 Days. It's Day 2, Struggle. I could do a whole lecture just on that artwork, but just to answer your question, it's Obama's struggle. It's all the struggle that went before him. It's a massive kind of piece of work that references so much. But on a personal level, it was also my own struggle. In practice, making this work and going on the campaign, I just like say it as if it was easy. It really, really, really wasn't. This work on lots of levels, as a woman, as a mother, and as an individual, was a huge achievement for me. And then to answer your second question, my children, this work has been a massive part of their life. And I remember vividly when I had decided that I wanted to make it, having newspapers and magazines on our kitchen table, and there having, you know, my husband having never seen Black men on the cover of magazines or newspapers. There was Obama every day, every week, every supplement. And my boys, and then my daughter, they've grown up with that. But that did not happen until really literally their generation. And that's for every child around the world. So we don't know yet what the long-term legacy of that is, but actually that's huge. That's a massive, massive change. And it's not one that you can instantly measure. And so my children have grown up with that, and they've grown up with this work that I made it's not so much about Obama. There's only one image with his face in it. It's about them. It's about all of us. But it's specifically about them, actually. And so, but, you know, they've said different things about it as they've grown up, and they're on their own journey of understanding their mixed heritage, and that's a very profound journey for them. I have spent the last 15 years thinking about this topic, not just for them as a mother, but in my workplace. And so I think that is a big deal.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's incredible. So hard to move on after that, right? There's so many interesting things about the story. I mean, like I say, I keep on coming back to the story. It's just so fascinating. But maybe we could talk about, so you mentioned the picture behind you with the raised fist, and also the fact that you have both a daughter and sons. And, you know, it's funny because I was looking at the artworks but before we started having this conversation, and it struck me what's interesting. So I saw the fist, and I was like, well, that actually also reminds me of the Rosie the Riveter type images. And what I think is sort of interesting about the fist is that you can't really tell if it's a man's fist or a woman's fist. And so you were in Obama's campaign, but some of the images strike me as having, dealing with the issue of masculinity, but also bringing in the gender angles. It's sort of interesting. And you mentioned that you talked to many Black women. Would you like to say something about, the
well, I was
dimension
really,
of this
really
work?
aware that I was not American making this work. And so in a sense, I sort of represented the global community. And I was making work that was about all of us. I really felt that this story, they said at the time, was the most watched in human history. The whole world was watching, whether they agreed, disagreed, whatever their politics were, everybody was watching, everybody was part of this story in one shape or form. And so, and I was a woman, on that campaign, making a story about primarily a man, but, and politics has generally been a man's world. Slowly it's changing. So I was very aware of kind of wanting to think about what everybody's part in this story was. And that was kind of about race and skin color. It was about age. I was doing it for my babies. I was thinking about them as well as the older people whose stories I listened to, but also, gender, men and women. And so women were obviously a massive part of that campaign, and African American women, had a kind of extraordinary voice in that campaign. As I said, I spent 2 or 3 years I had hundreds of drawings from the campaign, my sketches, photographs. I had such a huge amount of material. I then spent 2 years kind of researching all of these themes and thinking about them. And I then came up with these 7 images and each one has, so many layers to it that we could do a whole talk on each one. But the raised fist is kind of in many ways most kind of associated with civil rights, and Mandela's the Mandela and Martin Luther King, and then Olympic, salute. And more recently, Black Lives Matter. But actually, the feminist movement in the 60s used it after the Miss World pageant and put it inside the female gender symbol. Republicans have used it, the socialists have used it. It's been it's actually a symbol of power and change and struggle that has been used almost by most peoples across the world through time in different ways. So actually its history is incredibly powerful, and women's part of that history is just as important as men's part. So in fact, this is a drawing of Obama's hand, but I did kind of intentionally make all of these artworks kind of universal, iconic images. So they're all rooted in in specifics, but they also reference kind of a whole history of struggles and movements, including feminist and female movements. We could talk about Pink Obama. That was about kind of how I was thinking about how he redefined in many ways masculinity in relation to power and race.
What really strikes me about your work, and which appeals to me especially as an academic who spends, I spend a big chunk of my time doing research. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on your process and in terms of research, and also like how do you view the importance of research? I guess nowadays in this time as academics, we feel like nobody cares about our expertise anymore, and people dismiss research, they dismiss facts, they don't think about experts have anything to say anymore. And so what's your take on the importance of research for your process, and also more generally?
Well, more generally, obviously, I mean, I do a lot of huge amount of research, and I believe in it. I don't think that you can dismiss research, because I think that, it's not possible for each individual to be an expert in everything. It's simply impossible. So in answer to your thing about this sort of idea that expertise is sort of less valued right now, that may be the case, but I can only think that it's temporary, because I don't think it's sustainable. And honestly, I think that it's a kind of way, because the opposite of expertise and research is opinion. Maybe I'm biased because I'm very research heavy, and I guess in some ways I sort of approach my work a little bit like an academic, and I really am interested in kind of research in relation to my work, because I'm interested in recording stories so that they last forever. And if it's just my opinion, that's why is my opinion more interesting than anybody else's? I mean, obviously each of us as individuals bring something unique that's incredibly valuable. So I'm not sort of dismissing that, but research allows you to kind of bring layers and layers and layers and other people's expertise, and in terms of my work, well, in terms of in 7 days, if I just come back and give them my opinion on the events that I experienced, I feel like that would have just got lost. And actually what I wanted to do was think about, what had gone before, what was happening, and in so many different layers and levels. And so each piece of work is kind of, as far as I'm concerned, is it kind of imbued with all of that research and history and other people's kind of ideas and not just other individuals, but whole peoples and whole periods of history and time. It means that I become my voice in a way is not paramount. The best kind of analogy I can think of is like a war artist. And there's been a tradition of sending an artist to battlefields to kind of experience what's happening, to kind of pull all of that experience into a whole series of work. And often those war artists work for years before they kind of release that work, because it's such a kind of massive experience for them, so many people's experience. And it doesn't tend to be that the artist comes back with just a kind of a single viewpoint. So yeah, I'm interested in my work in not being the kind of sole author, if you like. I'm interested in kind of more being a channel for a bigger story. This is much bigger than me. It's not my story.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, the way you describe it, it sounds to me like, you're a scientist, because that's exactly, what we do. We sit for years and study issues in order to discover what we think are
Yes.
universal truths, and also to take ourselves out of the picture, which I think is really interesting, because I don't think it's what people expect when they think about art, because a lot of times when things art is subjective, right? And so I think your approach is really interesting in terms of very research intensive and sort of taking yourself out of the picture. I mean, the fact that you spent 2 years without talking about what you were doing is sort of incredible. Yeah. So maybe we could touch a little bit, because Lizzie pointed out earlier, I have a picture on my mantelpiece. I've been dabbling in art to sort of survive the pandemic, and so as a result, I've become much more sort of aware of how difficult it is to make art. I mean, it's just, there's so many dimensions to it, but I guess one thing that really fascinates me in some sense is related to the previous topic, but how do you view the fact that you are a witness as sort of essential to the creation of the art, the participation? So right now I'm reading Susan Sontag's book on photography.
Oh.
Yeah, which I'm, also like incredibly interesting, and thinking about, the fact that, photography, this issue about whether you're standing back or participating. And then here you're doing this witnessing where you're really involved, but you're also standing back. So how do you view the witnessing as being essential to what you're doing?
So I would just say that there's an amazing chapter written by Marianne Saunders in the book about my work Encounters. It's an academic book, and she sort of deconstructs that witness and the kind of tropes of, or the history of women in religions and all the religious texts being the witness, but not the voice, and you know what that role is, and kind of references actually also Susan Sontag's book on photography. And I thought so much about what Susan Sontag has written, because there I was, my tools on the campaign were a sketchbook and a camera. And you know, Susan Sontag talks about how most photography is actually made implicitly for the sort of universal male gaze. And that the photographer themselves is usually a kind of a bit of an aggressor, in the sense of kind of coming and taking. And I was so aware of that. I was so, you know, I arrived and I got to sit right next to Obama, and I was not on the press rack. But on the press rack here, there were mostly men with these enormous cameras, sometimes great big aggressive, they look kind of guns or phallic symbols, huge things kind of in your face, you know. And there were banks of them. I really understood then kind of in a new way what Susan Sontag was talking about, this kind of aggressor. And the Day 5 Fear that I've made is really about exactly that. And that is in many ways the piece of work I made that is Obama's viewpoint, because that's what, you know, he saw all this time, and not just the photographers, but all of us taking photos all the time. And I took every single photo I took on the campaign was taken with this tiny instant camera, because I did not want to get kind of stuck behind the lens where I would become that. I wanted to be kind of in the experience and taking notice of everything, and not stuck with trying to find a perfect photograph or to kind of project. Basically, I didn't want it to become too much about me, which it does the minute you're behind the camera, kind of catching something, if you like. So I was very aware of not putting the camera up very often, and wherever I could, I also was taking notes and making sketches and drawings. So that was really, I was very focused on a lot of what is sort of discussed in Susan Sontag's book. And so I guess the kind of role of witness, as I saw it, was that I wasn't catching something then. And you know what? By mistake or serendipity or whatever, because I started to look for some things. I did take some incredible, extraordinary photos, and I syndicated them on the day that I took them, I probably would have, you know, I might well have earned far more money and have been, you know, but I didn't. I kept them back, and I still haven't released them, because actually I didn't want to kind of invest, because I would have removed myself from being a witness, and I would suddenly have become one more photographer, kind of where I was, I don't know, taking something or making it about that. And I really wanted it to be a witness that would kind of serve as a witness forever. And I think that's probably why I have sold this work primarily to museums, because I think they're in the business of thinking about what lasts forever, and what, you know, they have to consider they have to sort of have a role of what is our witness as a society of what is going on right now, and how do we kind of keep that?
Well, there's so many questions one could ask. You know, I guess if you think about go forward, so you talked about not releasing it. So I can imagine that there'd be material here for many years, but probably don't only want to do this work. And you're not only doing this work, you have like amazing other work. Could you talk a little bit about, you know, like what you're doing going forward and what inspires you in terms of which topics to tackle? I mean, it's a very time intensive process, obviously, right? So you have to choose carefully. So how do you go about approaching what the next project will be?
Well, you know, I'm nearly 50, and encounters took me, as you know, 10 years. So I'm very aware of the kind of now, oh God, I've only got a few more projects left that I can do in my whole life, even if I live to 100. So yes, I have to really carefully consider and think about it. I'm really interested in the stories that sort of are witnessing the stories that are happening now that I think will have kind of really profound impacts for years and years to come, and the stories that we don't really fully understand what their impact's going to be. And so I think that I'm trying to choose the topics and the stories that where being a witness is important. And after having done encounters where I sat in on the private meetings of the world's religious leaders over 10 years, and that was dominated entirely by men, lots of the work I've done has been, you know, actually about men. And so I'm also have been thinking about how I'm going to make a series of work kind of in response in a way to the last 20 years of my practice, which has ended up kind of, you know, where are the women, and how does it, so I'm also thinking about that. But I you know, my projects also germinate for a very long time, and I end up then doing a lot of research and then picking how I'm going to do it, and then there's the process of them making it.
Well, I think a lot of cultural change is necessary, and so that's why, you know, I think your work has a lot of potential in terms of being a catalyst. So I think, you know, the more of that, the better.
Well, thank you. That's actually literally the highest compliment, and I feel like I could be paid. So thank you.